This video is going to cover the topic of samples and populations. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video will be, what is the difference between samples and populations when we are collecting statistical data? So before we begin on those two terms, just a quick reminder about statistics. So a statistical question, just as a review, is one that can be answered by collecting data. So it's not just that there's one piece of information. You're going to collect a variety of data, and there is that variety in it. It's variable. The results are different from person to person, for example. So for example, if we look at these two questions, we have how many points did you earn on the last quiz versus what was the average score for 7th graders? This one would not be statistical, where this one would be statistical, right? Because we are collecting a whole bunch of information for this 7th grade. We'd have to get everybody's answers and we'd have to crunch the numbers from that. The first one is just one person answering, one and done, not statistical. And when it comes time to collect your data for your statistical question, there are kind of two approaches. You could use a population to get your data, or you could use a sample. Let's compare the two different entities, populations and samples. We'll start with population. So a population is an entire group of objects. So for example, you might look at an entire group of all the people in the world, or maybe your whole population is all the 7th graders at a school, or even it doesn't have to be people or humans. You could do all the apples that are grown in the US, right? The whole entity. On the other hand, a sample is a subset or a smaller group from the population as a whole. So instead of looking at all the people in the world, we're just looking at the leaders of each country, a smaller group from that larger pool. And instead of seeing all 7th graders at the school, maybe we just specifically hone in on the ones who are in band. That might be a sample group. And instead of looking for all the apples anywhere in the world, maybe we just focus on the apples that we have here at our school cafeteria, right? So we're just taking something larger and we're trying to find a smaller group or a smaller version of it. And we need to sometimes use samples because there are times when we want a whole lot of information, but it's just not feasible. We're just not able to ask everybody or look at every apple. And so we sometimes have to get a sample to represent that. If we wanted to know the average number of pets that the students in our class have, well, we're looking for just our class. That's our population. And if our population is our class, that seems totally doable. We could give a quick survey to the 30 or so people in our class to get our data. If I wanted to know, on the other hand, the average number of pets among Portland's 7th graders, that's a lot. It's not really that feasible for us to physically go ask all the 7th grade students that are all across the city. And when that's the case, we might need to select a sample instead. Let's think about some questions that we might be asking and answering, and think about whether we would want to use a sample, a small group, or whether we could use the whole population. Let's look at this list of potential survey questions or potential data collections, and we're going to see with a P or an S which one we think would be best served with a population that we could ask everybody or collect the data on everything, and which might be best with a sample. So the first one here, we're asking how many pepperonis are on a slice of pizza. Well, I think this is going to be best done with a sample. We just probably can't physically test all the pizza that comes out, right? So we could probably get a collection and do a little bit of a data collection just from a sample. The next one says, how many days a week do my friends do sports or dance practice? I think that since these are a specific group of people, I can go ahead and ask the whole population. That seems totally doable. How about how many hours do Selwood students spend on homework? Well, that's a big group. That would be a lot to ask every single person. I think this is another example of when we would probably do a sample. How far away do the students in our class live from our school? I think that's a population. Unlike the previous question about all students at our school, The ones in our classroom, we can easily go around and keep track. And this last one about which of the Harry Potter books has sold the most copies, I might actually argue doing this one as a population as well. And for that, I might do some data collection where I find out the total sales for each of the books and then compare. But doing it just at my local library or my local bookstore might not be what I'm looking for. When we are presented with statistical questions like the ones we've just seen, we need to think about what population would provide the answers we're looking for, and then where we could kind of narrow down a sample to test. So if we wanted to know the mean number of pages for the books that were bestsellers in the decade of the 1990s, the whole population that would solve that is to get all the books off that list, right? But that's a little large. So maybe a possible sample would just be to find maybe 20 of those books at our local library. So we can see the whole population that would solve our solution or give us our solution, and we can see a sample that might help us reach it that's a little more feasible. Maybe there's a need for us to know what fraction of cars were sold from a certain time period over 6 or 7 years. If we wanted to do that, the population that would give us that information would be to find the records of all the cars sold during that time period. So maybe instead a possible sample that we could use would just be to find 100 cars that we could look at that were sold during that time frame. Maybe we have an interest to find out the median income for teachers in North America. Well, that population would be all the teachers in the US, Canada, and Mexico, a pretty large population. Maybe instead of trying to ask that question of all teachers, we just look locally and talk about the teachers at our school as an example or sample group. And maybe we're interested in the average lifespan of the Tasmanian devil. Well, if we wanted to see the whole population, that would be all Tasmanian devils that had ever lived and died, so we could know how long they lived. So maybe instead we just look at the Tasmanian devils that are or have been at a local zoo. That might be a sample that we could use when that population is a little too hard to reach. Now, one thing to consider, of course, when you are using a sample is that the sample needs to be a good one for your research. It needs to give you the reliable information that you want. And we will talk, I'm going to bold this here, we will talk about making sure your sample is a good sample in the next few days, a day or so. Right now, I just wanted to do the distinction between population and sample. So when you come into class tomorrow, I just want you to have that distinction clear about population and sample. So for this section, I want you to look at these. These are kind of two different sides of one research or statistical question. And so you're going to circle the one that is population, and you're going to underline the one that is sample. So for example, I'll do the first one. If I'm looking at students at SMS versus the students in Miss White's class, the students at the school in total would be the population, and this would be the one group that would be in our class. That might be a sample group. So do that for the remaining two as well. And remember, the essential question was just to really focus on the difference between samples and populations. And we'll go a little bit more in depth with our samples as we move forward.